We have to make it all the way down to Mexico City. That's 1,000 miles away, which means we need to invest at least $1 trillion in Mexican infrastructure in order to reach at scale the 50, 60 million people who live in the center of the country. And we have to do so in a way that doesn't make the Mexicans think that we're trying to take over, which is kind of what we're trying to do. This is going to be touchy, but if we don't pull it off, we will not have the labor to do what we need to do. Because if we still want stuff in a post-China world, we need help to build it. We need a differentiated labor market. And the Mexicans are the only ones within arm's reach that can help with that. There are other players that are further abroad, but we can't integrate with them the same way we can integrate with a neighbor. The Southeast Asian countries look pretty good to me. Thailand is the fastest aging one, but it still has at least another 25 years. The Indonesians and the Vietnamese are great. In fact, the Vietnamese are kind of scary. They've expanded their higher educational system with technical skills in mind. 40% of college grads in Vietnam are STEM graduates. They are attempting, and it looks like they're going to pull it off, to leapfrog over China from a technological point of view, and they will probably achieve that within the next 3 or 4 years. There's also a geography situation that is very helpful. On the left, you're looking at a vegetation map, basically, and the green is tropics. And when you think about building infrastructure in tropics, in mountains, on peninsulas, on islands, it's an expensive, ugly business because you really can't get economies of scale. But there's pros and cons to that too. The con is that these countries have never gone to war with one another like they have in, say, Europe or Northeast Asia. There's not a lot of bad blood. And that means that almost everyone started out in tropical agriculture. And if there's one thing that everyone in tropical agriculture can agree on, is it's that no one wants to be in tropical agriculture. In temperate zone agriculture, there's a value chain. You don't have to do it all by hand. You can get a tractor, you can get a combine, you can get a spreader. In the tropics, no. Tropical fruits, harvested by hand, tended to by hand, transported by hand. You can't have a combine harvesting mangoes. It's all unskilled labor. And so whenever people in tropical ag have a chance, they move out and they go to the cities, and that means population density. Their cities are wildly overpopulated for the skill set of the labor. And that means this is the most competitive part of the world for value-added manufacturing. This is where we're going to see a big footprint expand. Already has. You're talking about 1 billion people. There are already more people in coastal Southeast Asia than there are in coastal China. They're probably the biggest winners in the world after Mexico. But it will look different. Population density again. You'll notice that there aren't threads. When you look at a more normal population structure in an industrialized or industrializing country, you get your urban hub, and then you've got threads of highways that are densely settled going out to the next population center. And that allows for what we consider to be multi-step supply chains, because there's multiple population centers linked together tightly. You can move things back and forth through the system. That doesn't happen in Mexico. It's desert, it's mountainous, it's jungle, combination thereof. And so each urban core will be good, very good at 1 or 2 things. And that's it, because they don't have access to a complementary system. So what we do in the United States is we might make the frame, we send it across, they put in the spark plugs, they send it back, we put in the computer system, we send it back, they put in the seats. And it's going to different cities each time. And it's that back and forth that makes it work. But they can't do that at scale within their own system. They have to have that partner. The Vietnamese do not. It's a much more traditional system from our point of view. And so the Vietnamese can do top to bottom manufacturing. The only thing they have to worry about are the components that they can't make themselves, which are substantial. But you can have Vietnam as almost a one-stop shop for most of what we need. We just can kind of add the dusting of the tech that's necessary to make it work. It's cheaper to do. Unfortunately, it's 7,000 miles further away, so we can't do the back and forth. 2 different models. All right, let's talk products. If you're at the top of this, you don't know who your 3rd-tier suppliers are, much less your 13th. If you're at the bottom, you can probably fit your entire supply chain on the back of a cocktail napkin after throwing back a few bourbons. If you're on the left, or excuse me, on the right, you're already within the NAFTA system. If you're on the right, you're dependent on the Chinese. Couple examples. Energy. American energy is made with American capital. It's on American pipelines, American workers going to American refineries, ending up with an American consumer. And that is not simple at all. 1,400 supply chain steps for the iPhone, 91% of which involve mainland China in some fashion. The new iPhone just came out a couple weeks ago. You might want to buy 2. We're probably getting close to the point where this is the last one. Here's everybody else. Going to pull out a few of these. Automotive. Courtesy of NAFTA 2, over 90% of the supply chains for autos sold in North America are manufactured in North America. Don't mean to suggest we're not going to have some hiccups, but the core of it has already worked and the rest is just network effects. That's not bad. In terms of foreign investors, the Europeans are of the belief that they can bring in all the parts and just assemble it here. That's not going to work very well. The Asians have figured out that they need to actually do the manufacturing here. So they're probably north of 70% manufactured within North America, where most European companies are less than 10. Heavy vehicles are going to be a problem, though. When you have globalization, it's very common for countries to put their thumbs on the scale to encourage parts of the industrial plant to be in their countries, especially if it's something they can technologically do without a lot of help. As big as they are, a forklift is actually simpler than a passenger car in terms of the equipment and the construction. And since not everybody needs a forklift, it's not like you're going to have these facilities everywhere. So the Chinese really have dominated that space. So forklifts, dump trucks, construction equipment, agricultural equipment, we're going to have a real problem when the Chinese go away. But it is a relatively easy fix because anyone who can do automotive at scale can also do heavy equipment at scale. It's just a question of the numbers being right. And nothing like half of the stuff vanishing from the world is going to make the numbers right. That's where I'm worried the most. A successful electronics and computing sector requires a lot of different labor price points because the person who does the plastic molding is not the person who does the die cast or pulls the wire or builds the chip or does the software or polishes the lenses. That's a different step with a different skill set at a different price point. And one of the many reasons that the East Asians are so good at this is you've got 11 different labor sets within one extended market. And they can all specialize at what they do best. We don't have that in North America. We have 2 price points. Us, Mexico, that's it. And so we have to change how this is all done. The textiles example gives me hope that we can, but I have no idea in hell how. Because we haven't had to figure it out yet. But we're going to have to, real soon. And we probably are going to have to do it without northern Mexico, because that's already spoken for. All right, here's where things get a little messy. Not all semiconductors are made equal. We all hear about the CHIPS Act and what the Biden administration wants to do. That's for a very, very specific kind of chip. 10 nanometer and smaller, the most advanced one in the world. Now, today, 92% of those come from Taiwan, 8% from South Korea. If every facility that is under construction in the United States because of the CHIPS Act ultimately comes to fruition, we will be making less than 5% of the global total. It's a start. It's not huge. The Koreans and the Taiwanese have been working on this for a long time. Here's the problem. The Taiwanese manufacture most of them. They fabricate most of them. But most of the technology that allows them to do so is not Taiwanese. They just have the end production. There's a coalition of over 9,000 companies worldwide, half of which only produce one product for one customer that ends up in a Taiwanese facility. You pull any of those out of the constellation, the whole thing stops until you repair the constellation. We're going to have to rebuild an entire environment in order to continue putting these chips together. That's going to take a decade. All it takes is one country falling out. I'm personally most concerned about the Germans on this one. Now, on the other extreme, You've got the dumb chips, the 90 nanometer and bigger. This is your Internet of Things, your smart blender, the shower brush that sings to you, your smart lights. 80% of those are made by the Chinese, and they can do that without outside help. The other 20% is kind of a split between Japan and the United States. Now, if the Chinese were to vanish tomorrow, obviously the Internet of Things would just die. I would argue that's not that big of a deal. And we have the technology, we have the knowledge. We don't have to reinvent anything. We just need a couple years to build low-end fab facilities. The Mexicans are very interested in getting into that space. The problem that they face is bilingual technical language skills. If you've got kids who are looking for a way to make a lot of money really quick, tell them to learn how to assemble chips and to do it in Spanish and go down there and be translators, because that is going to be the single biggest friction point in the bilateral relationship for the next decade or two. And then everything in the middle, 10 to 90, that's your car. That's your planes. That's most power management systems. That's smart meters. We're probably okay there, because those are made in Germany and Italy and here, in Japan and Korea, Taiwan, even a little bit in China with imported gear. That looks okay. It's the high end I'm really worried about, because those high end chips, that's AI. All these server farms are getting built to do AI at scale. No, we're not going to have the chips for it. That's the iPhone. We're not going to have the chips for them. That's electric vehicles. Electric vehicles have 2 to 3 grand worth of chips, and they're all either the very high end or the very low end. We won't be able to sustain it, and everything that comes from it. Now, for you guys' world more specifically, here's your lives. Yeah, there's no way to fix that fast. Order from everyone? Find a way? Counting on half of them not making it. That's the biggest sticking point you guys have by far. This doesn't look that great either. This is space that the Chinese dominate utterly, and replacing that at scale is not a 2-year program. It's not just the manufacture. The assembly requires a lot of fingers and eyes and a lot of quality control, and there is no other country in the world that can step into that space quickly. So we're talking about a significant build out that's not just capital intensive, but is very labor intensive, and it is not clear where, if that can happen with today's technology. This stuff we kind of do in our sleep. Okay, the stuff in the middle, this is the stuff we do in our sleep. The United States is a weird economy in that we're very, very high end and very, very low end at the same time. We have a lot of elbow room, we have a lot of forest, we have a lot of wood, and courtesy of the shale industry, we have a lot of things that are energy intensive, that we're the world's most competitive. None of that's in danger. And this is the stuff that the Mexicans are going to be helping us with. The slower China breaks down, the more time we have to build the industrial plant that we need to give you guys the guts of what you need. But that means working with the Mexicans as forward-looking as possible to build the stuff out so we don't start the day that stuff from China just vanishes. Oops. There we go. My biggest concern about China is the information blockade in there has now become so intense that we just can't get information at all. And we might not find out that the government has collapsed until the stuff just stops arriving. We're not going to have a lot of warning. All right, I showed you guys this last year, population density map on this side, economic map on this side. The areas that are populated are also the areas that are economically viable. It's a pure weather thing. Russia has weather. People live where it's less. The Russian strategy is pretty straightforward. Expand out of the weather or the area that's decent until you hit a series of geographic barriers that you can't shove tanks through. And then forward position your military in the access points between them. Ukraine is in the unfortunate position of not controlling those access points, but it's on the way to one in Romania and one in Poland. So whenever the Russians are done with Ukraine, if they can win, they will move on to the next line of countries, 5 of which are in NATO. American, Western foreign policy is very simple. Prevent them from having that opportunity. Now, here we have the Ukrainian demographic structure. After independence in 1992, over a third of the population either left or died. Some of the lowest birth rates we've ever seen. Another third of the population since the war has fled as refugees, mostly women and children. So this is pre-war data. We're very close to the point in Ukraine where they will not have the population density that is required to maintain industrial level infrastructure. So whether it is food or steel or coal or just stuff transiting, Ukraine is not going to survive the next 30 years, even if they win the war. There's another problem in that space. This is, hang on, my hair's falling apart here. This is the Russian permafrost. It's a geological phenomenon. You go 10 to 30 feet down and you hit a layer where it never melts. But the top chunk melts in the summer and turns into a bog. It is the most difficult environment in the world for mineral extraction. So the Russians have the most expensive upfront cost to bring stuff online. You basically have to wait for it to freeze solid. You run a berm out to your production site. You run a rail line or a pipe or a road along that berm, and then you have a pad that you drill from when it's frozen, because you can't drill through mud. It's a very dynamic landscape, because if an aquifer cracks open, everything just kind of slides and follows the aquifer. Or maybe it drains down, in which case you just get a sinkhole pit that opens. Or maybe there's no aquifer and you just get a warm summer, and the vegetation that's been frozen for eons starts to thaw, starts to decompose. Decomposing vegetable matter gives off methane, and the whole land buckles. Which means that the Russians have the highest maintenance costs for any mineral production in the world. Here's the problem. Russian population structure. Now, about the time that people who were 15 were getting born, 2004, 2005, that's when the Russians stopped collecting data and just started making it up. So you've got that big gouge in the 20-somethings, post-Cold War birth rate collapse, and then you have fabricated data. There probably are only half as many children as this data would suggest. The Russian educational system collapsed back in 1985. So we had a collapse in the birth rate, a collapse of the educational system, which means that the youngest people in Russia who actually have technical skills at scale, they turned 62 this year. The year before the Russians started fabricating data, the life expectancy for the average Russian male was 67. They already had the worst skilled labor pool relative to their population and their needs in the world, and they're very close from simply losing all of it. The maintenance on the Russian systems, the development on the Russian systems, hasn't been done by the Russians for the most part. It's been done by BP or ExxonMobil, and especially the Dutch and the Germans, and all that went to zero when the war started. So whether it's sanctions, war damage, or simple lack of maintenance, we need to prepare for a world where everything that the world has become reliant upon from the Russians, palladium, platinum, oil, gas, even timber, just doesn't come anymore. There's another angle to it that's a little uglier. Now, this guy, you can see where the ethnic Russian territories are in the top left. You got Turkic minorities off to the east and the south. The problem is this is not an ethnic map, it's a population change map. The green zones are where population growth is happening roughly on par with Florida and has for 4 decades. And the red zones are population losses roughly equivalent to Detroit and has been for 4 decades. Almost all the raw materials are produced in the green zones that are not controlled by ethnic Russians, where they're experiencing population growth, but they're shipped through and processed in the red zones, where the last bits of the skilled labor pool are, that is in terminal decline. So you can add demographics to the reasons that we need to kiss the Russian stuff goodbye as well. Not to mention that this is going to be a very politically unstable region in the not too distant future because of the mismatch. One of the many reasons that the Russians feel that the Ukraine war is necessary is if they can get to kind of that outer crustal defense that they used to have in the Soviet period, then they can focus their forces internally to police this demographic flip. They're fighting for time. If they can pull this off, they probably buy themselves another 50 years. If they fail, they're gone within 20. All right, let me take a big dump on green tech. We talked about this a little bit last time I saw you guys. I think I even showed you this graphic. I mean, oversimplifying here, but thermal power, internal combustion engines, not all that complicated. You light a match, you start a fire, you capture the heat in some way. Can't do that with an EV system, can't do that with green tech. The process of producing the energy, transmitting the energy, storing the energy requires an order of magnitude more materials and different materials. We're looking here at an EV versus an ICE vehicle. You can just see at a glance. And then here's the same kind of idea, but for generation, with solar and wind at the top, conventional thermal at the bottom. We need 3 times as much copper by 2030. We need 20 times as much lithium. We need 10 times as much nickel. There isn't enough on the planet to pull that off. And the Russians are a top 3 producer of these things. So it can't happen. It's not physically possible with today's technology for the world. There is one way it might be possible for us. This is where all the stuff comes from that is not what we would consider to be part of our friends and family network. If we use our military, which is done with the war on terror, which is recruited and rested and rearmed, and we go and conquer all of these places, and we run a Belgian imperial-style extraction empire and bring all of it home, then we can do the green transition, but no one else. Now, this is not a recommendation. I'm just saying that the path we're on, this is the only way that it works. And even that would not be enough because you still have to turn it into processed material. Lithium ore is useless. You have to turn it into lithium metal. The red bars are the stuff where that processing happens in either China or Russia. And even that's not enough. You have to talk about finance. Here you're looking at the full cycle cost for a natural gas combined cycle plant. The blue is the construction, the siting, the building. The gray is the fuel, full life cycle. This is a model you're familiar with. This is what you all do. The idea is it's a subscription model. You pay as you go. That doesn't work for green tech. For green tech, it's almost all up front. This is wind. Capital costs have tripled. They will triple again. I think most of the plans that were put out there 4 years ago assumed that there would never be a 100 basis point increase in capital costs. We've now gone up by 500. We have another 500 to go. The market can't support this. The IRA will help, maybe sand down some edges. But we're going to have to do something that in the United States we really don't like doing. We're going to have to choose what we want to focus on. The smart play would be to put solar panels where it's sunny, not in Massachusetts. Put wind turbines where it's windy, not in Florida. And wire the power to where we actually live. But we're not going to do that. That's the smart thing. All right, another matrix. If you're at the top, you want the government out of your personal life. If you're at the bottom, you think the government should regulate social norms in some way. If you're on the right, you want the government out of your wallet. And if you're on your left, you think the government should intervene in people's wallets to get the resources it needs to remake society in some way. And you can kind of combine these things. So if you're at the bottom right, an economic and a social conservative, you're kind of opposed to food stamps on principle because famine builds character. And if you're at the top left, a social liberal and an economic conservative, you want to bring all of the bureaucrats in Washington together for a big party where you'll serve arsenic cake. Here are our political factions. The single biggest effect that Donald Trump had is he elevated a faction to prominence that really hadn't voted before. Most of the people who voted for him the first time he ran for president hadn't voted in the previous 4 presidential elections. A lot of different estimates for how many people that is, but all of them are north of 10 million voters. They are now not simply the single largest voting bloc in the country. They've taken over the Republican Party. Because in calling to these people, Trump ended up picking fights with what he would call the rhinos. people who were the traditional leaders of traditional leaders of the policy. He ejected them from his White House. He campaigned against their candidates in Congress, and he completely purged them from the Republican national conventions. They're not even present in the decision-making apparatus of the party now. And in effect, they've become swing voters. But he was able to attract other factions that were closer to his social conservative core supporters. And a lot of people have switched sides. This is the MAGA coalition. This is the Republican Party of today. This has lots of consequences. Let's focus on 3. First, the unions are swing voters. That hasn't happened in a century and a half. We're entering a period where we need to double the size of the industrial plant. How many of those jobs do you think are blue collar? We have a labor shortage, and we will for at least another decade, probably 2. We're going to see the greatest increase in union activity and union power in the history of the Republic in the next 10 to 20 years. The business community are swing voters now. That hasn't happened in the last 150 years. And this is crazy because, the unions versus business, that tug of war, that is modern economics. Their discussions, their debates, their compromises, their negotiations, that is our economic policy for 5 generations. And these people are right now not even in the room. Part of the reason why economic policy out of both the Obama and the Trump administration just seems so nuts is because there's no one in either administration that can do math. In fact, on both sides, they're kind of offended by the concept that you need to be able to do math to run an economy. The group that most fancies themselves economists in the Biden administration today are the Greens. Until such time as the unions or the business or both end up in one coalition or the other, economic policy making, decisions, choices about where we need to focus are going to be completely divorced from reality. And this is going to last bare minimum for another presidential cycle. Now, we will get through this. The idea that the 2 economically most capable, competent, and numerous voting blocs on these topics are going to remain outside the political system, that's silly. But it's going to take time for us to figure out where they're going to land. And the political coalitions are going to look very, very different on the other side. So, best of luck. Because not only will you not be getting good guidance or regulation, there isn't a logic to it. And that's just the environment you're operating in at a time when you're going to have to at least double the grid. No pressure.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, just taking a walk after this guy dumped on us. The big news today, it's February the 5th, is that overnight local time, Iranian-backed militants in Syria attacked another U.S. base. This is the first significant attack since those 3 American soldiers were killed early part of last week. And the United States launched a bunch of retaliatory strikes against Iranian-backed militias throughout the region. Anyway, this is the first significant action by them since, and again, it looks like a drone got through and hit the barracks again. This time, it wasn't American service people who were killed, but a half a dozen Kurds that U.S. Special Forces were training. Let me explain how we got into the Middle East and why it's difficult to get out, and then we'll put this into context. So, going back very roughly, 1,000 years. The Middle East has not been a place that anyone wanted to be. It was on the way somewhere. So you had your more advanced, somewhat, very loosely using this term, technocratic societies with a little higher value add in their economic systems in the West. And then you had East Asia, and to a lesser degree, Southeast Asia and South Asia, that produced goods that you could not find in the West, things like spices and porcelains and silks. And so the trick was to figure out how you could link these 2 economic systems together despite the vast distances involved. And from roughly 1000 to roughly 1500 AD, the solution was coastal vessels, camels, caravans. The problem with all of those things is you had to go through any number of intermediaries, especially for the land routes. And since the sea routes weren't safe, most people stuck with the land routes. This meant that the folks who lived in between, in the middle, to the east of the Western nations, ergo the name, found themselves having to pay massive markups because you'd send your gold east and you'd bring the cargo west, and every few miles or few dozen miles, there would be another middleman who would take their cut. And so the cost of these products didn't double or triple or quadruple, but typically went up in cost by a factor of 1,000 or so. And so what were not necessarily everyday goods, but not exactly considered exotic goods out east, became the cream of the luxury goods in the West. And so the trick was to how do you avoid those markups? The solution was hit upon by the Spanish and the Portuguese, who developed the technologies to sail farther from the shore. With old coastal vessels, if you happened to anchor, which you had to do every night, within sight of land, there was a reasonable chance that somebody who lived in the neighborhood was just going to come and take your ship and kill your people and take all your stuff. So that's one of the reasons why they tended to prefer the land routes. But with the Portuguese and the Spanish developing deep water navigation, they were able to do an end run around that entire thing, interfaced directly with the east. And so from roughly 1500 until roughly 1900, the Middle East just didn't matter. It became a complete backwater. And eventually the Western countries industrialized. And when they came back to the Middle East, to an area that had not industrialized, you bring a knife to a gunfight enough times and the locals pay attention. And so you basically had the Brits, the French, and the rest divvy up the entire region into mandates and colonies. Now, why was the West able to pull that off when the Middle East just kind of stayed at the same technological level? And to be perfectly blunt, the answer is rainfall. Throughout the Western countries in Europe, it rains. Rain means that you can grow crops in any number of areas, and that gives people an interest in pursuing their own economic destinies. Also, you had winter in most of those areas, so in the off-season, farmers could be working on something else. They weren't exactly getting law degrees, but the point is the overall skill level of the population steadily creeped up. And when you've got a lot of people who are vested in stability in the system, even if it's not a democracy, you get a degree of political stability, economic advancement, technological acumen that you just don't get in the Middle East. In the Middle East, very few places have rain. Where you do have water, it's in a relatively narrow band, either right on the coast or along a river. And that makes it very, very easy for a political authority to rise and dominate that specific geography, and in doing so, basically reduce the entire population to slave status. That does not give people a lot of interest in pursuing stability for the system. It makes revolutionaries very popular, but it also means that the power of the state is just almost total, making it very, very difficult for anyone to make something of themselves. So you will get centers of learning throughout the Middle East who did absolutely preserve Western knowledge during the Dark Ages, but they never applied it themselves. They never disseminated it within their own cultures. They were basically just libraries maintained by monks. Oversimplification, 1,500 years of history, I recognize that. But you can't deny the economic trajectory of the Middle East versus the West. And then once the West cracked the code on industrial technologies and they started having gunpowder and cannon, and the Middle East was left behind, there was no contest at all. So now, today, the economies of the Middle East matter more to the world today than they have for most of the last half millennia, largely because of oil, because there is an asset those industrial economies need in order to function. Now, this isn't so much an American problem directly because North America is self-sufficient, well, not even self-sufficient in oil, it's a significant exporter of oil. And if the Middle East were to vanish tomorrow, we'd have some adjustments on things like crude quality, but within a couple of years, we'd be totally fine. However, the Europeans, significantly less so, specifically since the Russian crude is no longer part of their equation. Okay, now where does that bring us? Well, it means that anyone who goes into the Middle East after about 1950 is faced in a very different environment from what was faced from 1000 AD to 1500, when it was just a place you had to push through, or from 1500 until roughly 1950, when the West was industrialized but the Middle East wasn't. Now the Middle East is. And no one's going to say that a group like ISIS in Syria is like the pinnacle of human technology, but it's really easy for them to get explosives and AK-47s. So it's no longer a contest like we saw from 1900 to 1950 between an industrialized Western imperial system and a completely non-industrialized, almost tribal Middle Eastern system. You've got a different makeup now. Now, the governing systems of the Middle East themselves are also in play and very much in flux, because before 1950, you basically had a series of what could be best called fortress political systems, where by dint of geography, maybe they had an oasis like Damascus, maybe they were surrounded by desert like Egypt, maybe they were a mountain fastness like Iran. It's a little difficult to get in and out, and some of these areas are a lot more difficult to conquer than others, Iran probably being at the top of that list. But you introduce industrial technologies to this area in the post-colonial, post-World War II environment, and all of a sudden, they're not just drilling for oil, they're building roads, they're buying military hardware, and it makes for a very different mix. You get this incredibly brittle, top-down, concentrated political system that is absolutely incapable of providing the people with a level of technological progress that is possible elsewhere in the world, because there's very little to work from aside from cash, from oil. And you apply that in a world where society is weak. And the result, you get lots and lots and lots and lots of militant groups. And if you want to back one versus the other or one versus government, that's fine. But even if you win and the militant group overthrows the government, well, then what? You've taken what little order exists in an area and it's turned into chaos. You get complete societal breakdown, as we've seen in places like Egypt and Iraq and Syria in recent years. So, enter the United States. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration felt that the best way to fight al-Qaeda was to make sure that the countries that allowed al-Qaeda to function would go after it. So after the Afghan operation, we discovered that al-Qaeda scattered to the winds, and we found out that a lot of the recruits were coming from Syria, because that was how the Syrians got rid of their own dissidents. A lot of the troops, Taliban troops that were in Afghanistan, fled through Iran to parts unknown, because the Iranians were like, well, we hate these guys, but we don't want to deal with them, especially since they don't like the Americans very much. And then the Saudis, not necessarily the government itself, but a lot of elements within Saudi Arabia were part of the ideological and financial underpinning that made al-Qaeda possible. How do I know that? Because we allied with them back in the 80s to form the Mujahideen, which eventually became the Taliban. Anyway, so the U.S. is looking at this region, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. We're like, well, conquering any of them wouldn't be fun. Conquering all three at the same time to get after a militant group just doesn't seem like the right task. And so the solution that was struck upon was to knock over Iraq and occupy it with armored tank brigades, which is not the way you pacify a population. You want ground infantry for that. The idea is Tehran and Damascus and Riyadh, none of them thought the U.S. was going to do this. And so when it did it with tanks and left the tanks there, they're like, shit, there's nothing to stop the United States from turning on us. And while Iran was to a degree protected by its mountains and had a little bit more confidence and would be able to put up a good fight, the other two had no such confidence. And they knew that if the United States decided to come for them, that their regimes were done. Because there was no civil support. There was no technical competence. There was no cohesion. Well, it worked. And those three countries went after al-Qaeda for us. And are the primary reasons, the strategy is the primary reason, why al-Qaeda is, for all intents and purposes, no more. The problem is that we didn't declare victory and went home. We tried to make Iraq look like Wisconsin, with the results that you can imagine, because again, there's nothing to build from in terms of society. We overthrew what stable order there was and replaced it with nothing. Now, fast forward to today. The W. Bush administration felt they had no choice but to go in, and, we can debate whether it worked out well or not. First phase of the plan, I think, worked. Second phase, Obama changed nothing, despite his rhetoric. Trump said he pulled out, but left troops in places like Syria to fight ISIS, because no one in the U.S. political system wants to be blamed for being the guy who allowed that militant group to come back. But here's the problem. The countries in these areas are never going to have the foundation that's necessary to form a country in the way that Americans or Westerners in general, or even Asians, see it. And so if your goal is to prevent the creation or the operation or the resurgence of a specific type of militancy, you will be there forever. And that's one of the reasons why we called them the forever wars, because we found ourselves going to war with a military tactic as opposed to any specific group. And while most of our troops are out of the region now, what happened earlier today in Syria is the best that we can hope for unless the strategy changes. We are never going to be able to turn these countries into something that we would normally recognize as a peer or as even someone in the same category as the nation states that we have in most of the rest of the world. That's not how these areas work. They never have. They don't have the economic geography to try. And so we're left with a fun little discussion we have to have. Option A is stick it out forever, do what most of our forces have been doing in the region since the operation was slimmed down under Trump, and hunker in your bases and watch. And if something like ISIS bubbles up again, hit it with a hammer, go back to your bases, and watch some more. And if you do that, you'll be there forever. And while you're there forever, other militant groups who have their own ideas of who should be in charge will take pot shots at you. And that's what we've been seeing with the Iranians being the instigators. This is the new normal. This is the old normal. This is just what the region looks like. Option 2, leave. From a casualty point of view, it's easy. We're never going to make this area look like something that we want. Danger, if you leave, is that a group that you specifically don't like is going to boil up. Now, let me put that into context. Part of the reason that we're still there is we find the tactics of ISIS beyond repute. And we've seen that replicated in Hamas in the beginning of the Gaza war. We're not going to be able to defeat a tactic. But the fear is if we leave, more of these groups will boil up in a shorter period of time and eventually start not just attacking the locals, but our interests in the region as well. The problem with that theory is that it assumes that there's something better that can happen if we stick around. Something to keep in mind. This is an area of fortress cities. And historically speaking, when you don't have an external power like the United States in, those fortress cities start to enforce their own writ on the area. Now, we have enabled Baghdad to recover from the Saddam and the occupation areas, and it's doing a pretty good job of holding its own. What we're doing against groups like ISIS is basically taking some of the unknowns out of the equation for the other two major powers in this region, which are Damascus, Syria, and Turkey. If the United States were to vanish overnight, they would have to deal with these unknowns themselves. And we would have a much more aggressive effort from both countries to deal with groups like ISIS. That is more normal. And so we're actually in this weird situation where U.S. forces that are remaining in the region, even if they're just staying in their camps, have become the single greatest reason why the government in Damascus still exists. Because under normal circumstances, other regional powers would have moved in and smashed these groups that were patrolling out of existence. And that means the Turks get more involved, that means the Syrians get more involved, and that means the Israelis get more involved. And in that sort of contest, with Mesopotamia kind of acting as an anvil, we'd probably see the end of the Syrian government within 5 years. Of course, it would be bloody and horrible, because this is a region that can barely grow food itself, and it uses a lot of those energy imports or exports to buy food that it imports. So the capacity here for an outright civilizational collapse is very, very real. And agreed, the presence of U.S. forces is one of the few things holding the darkness at bay. Now, whether that is considered an American national interest or not, talk amongst yourselves.